Hi, everybody. Welcome to Funny Money, the podcast about the economy, how it works, and how it can work better. Andrés, why don't you tell them about our guest?
Today, we're going to be talking to Professor Nina Banks, who is an American economist, associate professor of economics at Bucknell University. She is the former president of the National Economic Association and is best known for her research and contributions to the economist Sadie Alexander and women in economics and feminist economics in general. She's also published work explaining the economic value of Black women's community activism. So, Professor Nina Banks, thank you so much for joining us here and coming on the show.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
All right, great. So let's go ahead and get started. And I'd like to kind of kick us off with a clip, actually, from Congresswoman Ayana Presley to get this conversation started for one of the resolutions that she recently put forward in the Congress.
Almost 100 years ago, Sadie Alexander became the nation's first Black person to earn a PhD in economics, solidifying her role as a fierce champion of a federal job guarantee. She knew that a reliable job was essential to the social and economic mobility of folks who for too long had been left out and left behind, and saw a federal job guarantee as the best way to achieve full employment and overcome the systemic economic barriers facing Black people across the country. The policy would later become a key demand of civil rights leaders.
So, Representative Ayana Presley was very influenced in her work and in passing legislation by Sadie Alexander. You are a scholar of Sadie Alexander, and one of the things that I found most fascinating and important about your work was kind of the use of narrative and the stories of many of the different leaders in our communities to bring about knowledge and insight. So tell us a little bit about that. What was that process like? What got you interested in researching Sadie Alexander, and how has that influenced your own thinking?
Sure, thank you. And let me also point out that I'm actually the scholar who uncovered that Sadie Alexander was the first economist in the United States to propose a federal job guarantee. So I had never heard about Sadie Alexander when I studied economics as an undergraduate or even as a graduate student. And I was exposed to her idea really in a volume of African American feminist thought that was produced by Darlene Clark Hine. And that was probably the late 1990s. I was a graduate student, but I was teaching a course on African American feminist thought. And there was an entry in it from 1930 that Sadie Alexander wrote for the National Urban League. It had been a speech. She turned it into an article, and it focused on, I think it was called Negro Women in Our Economic Life. Very short article, but it really piqued my curiosity about Sadie Alexander because Sadie Alexander was talking about things that feminist economists were talking about during the late 20th century when I was a graduate student. She was talking about what happened to the value of work produced within the household when it was taken out of the household and became a part of the market economy. So the devaluation of that household work. And so that was really interesting to me. And then I read an article that Julianne Malveaux called Missed Opportunity, Sadie Tanner Mossell Alexander and the Economics Profession. She wrote it in 91. I probably read it around 2000. And in that article, Julianne was talking about the loss to the economics profession and the nation more generally from not having Sadie Alexander as a part of the economics profession, right? So 1921, as you said, she was the first African American to get a doctorate degree in economics, faced discrimination as a woman, as a Black woman, and so she was not able to get employment as an economist. And eventually she goes back, gets a degree in law and becomes a lawyer, had a wonderful career as a lawyer. So as a feminist economist, I was really curious if I could do some of the work that white feminist economists were doing, which was going back and going through archives and trying to uncover or unearth the economic thought of early white women economists. I wondered if I could do that with Sadie Alexander. I had done archival research for my dissertation. So around 2003 was when I started going to the archives at the University of Pennsylvania to do a really deep dive. And that's where I really uncovered this, lifelong engagement that she had, ongoing in economic issues. The thinking at the time was, even by her family, that when she became a lawyer, she had stopped really focusing a lot on economic issues. But all of her speeches and a lot of her correspondence and committee work still focused on economic issues affecting African Americans.
So here on the podcast, one of the things that we do is try to make a heterodox approach to economics as accessible as possible to a large public that often doesn't know that heterodox economics is even a thing. So many people take for granted that like the neoclassical approach is the only one we can possibly inform ourselves about. Tell us a little bit about feminist economics generally, and then how the work of Sadie Alexander in particular deepened that understanding and that important insight to how we understand an economy.
So feminist economics is I think, a relatively new field within economics. It really started developing in the early 1990s. Julie Nelson, Jean Shackelford, Diana Strausman, or Nancy Folgray are some of the, I think, key figures in the development of feminist economics. And there are more mainstream feminist economists and those of us who are more heterodox. But I think what's common is that we are looking at gender, right? Various aspects of gender in the economy. Could be the relationship between patriarchy and capitalism for those of us who are heterodox. And I'm an intersectional feminist. So I am always looking at the intersection of gender and race and capitalism as well. So that's, kind of a general overview of feminist economics. But there is this, kind of project underway to unearth this unseen or forgotten history of our early women economists. So Sadie Alexander was, I think, broadly trained. I would classify her as a political economist, as an institutional economist, because her education was very interdisciplinary. She studied economics in her doctoral program. She had courses in economics, in sociology, and history. That was all a part of her program. So it was very interdisciplinary. And heterodox economics is also very interdisciplinary. Historical analysis was very important to her. It's important to heterodox economists. But what I want to say also is that she did not focus primary attention on women, right? And so I think there's a tendency to pigeonhole a lot of women economists in terms of issues that affect women. This is what has happened to some of the early women economists, for example. And I'm the economist who's done a lot of research on this. I'm forgetting her name. It'll come back to me, I hope. So this is not my research that uncovered this, but the feminist economists who looked at the early women economists, what they found is that they faced a lot of obstacles in publishing, for example, and so when they were able to publish, they were typically forced to publish on issues affecting women, even if they were broadly trained and most of their research didn't focus on women, right? So I say that because Sadie Alexander was also broadly trained, and when I think about her, I don't think about her primarily in terms of a focus on women or Black women in particular. Nonetheless, what she had to say about Black women in the economy in the 1930s, I think, is really important. And that's where most of her analysis on Black women occurred during the decade of the 1930s. So she's got, this piece, Negro Women in Our Economic Life, which was published in Opportunity Magazine by the Urban League. And that looked at the contribution of Black women to the economy. And for me, it's striking not only because she's talking about Black women, in terms of this, or women more generally, in terms of what happens when work is taken out of the household and goes into the realm of the market. But she's talking about Black women's higher rates of employment. And she's making an argument that that is really important to the well-being of our national economy, that Black women are producing a lot of output, and so it benefits the economy, and that it benefits the household. And that is significant because it represents oppositional thinking. She was forward thinking at the time, because it was a time when women were really, especially Black women who were had high rates of employment. These women were often viewed as problematic because they were not devoting most of their time to their households. Right. So she's making a case for Black women being employed in the industrial sector. Most Black women were employed as domestic servants. And then she has other articles, or not articles, but speeches in the 1930s, where she's also arguing that Black women should be economically independent. Again, at a time when the assumption is that a proper woman is dependent on a male householder. She's arguing that women should have their own money. And I think that she was influenced by the experience of her mother, because her father left her family when she was young. And so her mother supported her family. So she's saying that the Black women need to be economically independent. All women should be economically independent. And if they have a taste of economic independence, they are likely to then also want to pursue more political independence, right? So, So in the 1930s, I would view her as very feminist in her thinking about women's roles within the economy, and not just feminist, but also forward thinking.
So I want to get into unpaid labor a little bit more in a second, but first I want to talk about unemployment. So I work in media, and I have a lot of conversations with people on both sides of the political spectrum in varying degrees on the political spectrum. And when you talk about unemployment, there's this one perspective that unemployment is a problem because now we have an increased reliance on welfare. That's more like the Republicans and the right wing and the conservatives in the United States. And then you have some kind of progressive Democrats that are like, yeah, we're not fully measuring unemployment. What about all of the people that have stopped looking for work? And what about the people that have gotten multiple jobs? But it seems that even, very educated economists, usually orthodox economists, have this view that unemployment is a necessary feature in the economy. And that's where we kind of scrap the whole debate and say unemployment shouldn't exist at all. It is not a necessary feature of a well functioning economy. This is a major issue, and it's a racial justice issue. Can you talk a little bit about your work exploring the issue of and kind of how that led you to arrive to some of the conclusions you made? We'll get into a federal jobs guarantee in a bit, but really how unemployment is unnecessary and how that's a racial justice and social issue.
Well, actually, my research, I mean, because I'm a feminist economist, and so the work that I do really focuses on the history of Black women in work. I didn't enter into the conversation of federal job guarantees or full employment until I started researching Sadie Alexander. So for me, it would be really difficult to separate the two.
Mhm.
So Sadie Alexander always put the focus primarily on the well-being of African Americans and Black workers in particular. And so throughout the 20th century, what she observes is that African Americans always were the marginal workers. They're the workers who are the last ones to be hired and the first ones to be fired. And so her thinking about the role of Black people in the economy changes throughout the 20th century. And her thinking on the role of government in the economy also changes. And so during World War II, she becomes more of a proponent for government having greater involvement within the economy, because she was able to observe the effectiveness of programs that created jobs, right? The public works programs that created full employment or near full employment. So this was really the first time in our history where large numbers of African Americans had employment within the industrial sector to a large degree. And so she reasoned, because of that, that the federal government should continue to have programs at the end of World War II to be able to maintain a fully employed economy, public works programs. But her idea of public works programs were programs that were focused on pressing social needs, infrastructure, combating hunger, making sure that families in rural areas had access to electricity. But she also thought that unemployment was the biggest problem that the country faced, right? In fact, she even thought it was the biggest global economic issue, unemployment. And so her idea was that everybody who wanted a job should have a job as a right of citizenship, right? That it was a fundamental right that all people should have. And she believed that economic insecurity helped to give rise to racial unrest. She was doing her doctorate degree in, the early 1919, right until 1921. And so during that period of time, following the end of World War I, there was a lot of economic there was a downturn, right, that happens after World War I. And there is an increase in racial violence. And so that racial violence in 1919 during the Red Summer and 1921, Tulsa, all of that happened when she's working on her doctorate degree. And it left a really big impression on her thinking. And so when she talked about the need for economic security, it was also motivated by the desire to prevent white Americans from venting their frustrations against African Americans. That was always utmost in her thinking. And so she was a proponent of federal job guarantees, that the government should continue, that the government should provide jobs to everybody who wanted a job and was able to work. And she thought that this would not only benefit Black workers, but would also benefit white workers, right? And so the quote that I often give is a quote where she says that full employment is the only solution to the subjugation of the Negro and of the great masses of white workers.
So, I really want to talk about how a big problem associated with unemployment is there are many people, when they cannot find a job in the formal economy, will find a way to pay their bills and meet their basic needs by getting dollars through the informal economy. The criminalization of behavior in the informal economy and responding to a population of unemployed people just trying to survive has often been policing and putting people in prison. Can you talk a little bit about this? And I really want to get your perspective. You bring in a unique one. Oftentimes, when we think about unpaid labor, we think about household work, child rearing, cooking, cleaning, things of that nature. But you bring in an interesting perspective about Black women addressing a lot of the issues caused by intentional unemployment in the economy. Could you talk about that a bit?
I, you know, the work that I do on okay, so let me back up, right? Because I don't talk much about the criminalization of African Americans, but it is a kind of a underlying theme that takes place during the Great Migration. My dissertation research focused on that, and I've, been reading on it a lot lately because Sadie Alexander's dissertation focused on that period, as did Abram Harris Jr. So she's the first African American economist, and he was the second. And so I was working on an article recently that compared the economic thought of the two of them when it comes to the Great Migration, comparing their graduate research. And so that's a really important thing because as African Americans are migrating from the South into the North, increasingly they are criminalized by white Americans who are arguing that African Americans are engaging in problematic behavior. So Abram Harris spent quite a bit of time in his master's thesis talking about the problem of African Americans being criminalized and the effect that would have, I suppose, on certainly arrest rates. Sadie Alexander didn't talk about it too much. And so it's not really a topic that I have addressed either. When I talk about Black women's unpaid work, I approach it very differently than the way that unpaid work is conventionally understood anywhere, right? In the profession. And so my frustration with feminist economics is that in the United States, feminist economics continues to be primarily focused on the history and the lived experiences of middle class white American women. It continues that. And so, I wrote this dissertation a long time ago on African American women who were migrating from the South into the North, and many of the obstacles that they had in work, and also being made to perform, kind of unpaid work on behalf of their communities. But over time, as I thought about my own life in terms of the work that I do and the work that other African American women do who are divorced or never married or live in multi-generational households, what I really came to really understand and appreciate is that the feminist literature, which emphasizes relations within a household between a couple, typically a heterosexual couple, although it's extended now to same-sex couples, but that really is not the lived experience of a lot of Black and brown women, especially African American women in the United States. So if I think about African American women today, right, who are often not in a household as part of a couple, they're still performing a lot of unpaid work. In many cases, they're performing more than a woman who has a partner within the household because they only have one set of hands to do it. And then if I think back on African American history, what I also know is that African American women have always performed a lot of work that is unpaid, but on behalf of the community. So my analysis of unpaid work focuses on work that is not performed simply within a household. I'm not talking about the allocation of unpaid work between a couple within a household. Instead, I'm looking at the experience of African American women who are doing a lot, who have done and continue to do a lot of unpaid work on behalf of their community, right? And as you said, it's in response to unmet needs. So in the late 19th century, in response to Jim Crow segregation, African Americans, they're moving to cities, either in the South, increasingly in the 20th century into the North as well. But city officials are not responsive to the needs of African Americans, or they are allocating funds, but they aren't allocating enough funds. And so the African American community takes it upon itself to build institutions, and African American women played a really key role in that process. And they're performing work, and it's unpaid, and it's on behalf of the community. So the argument that I make is that we really need to move away from thinking narrowly about economic activities and work in terms of what takes place within the workplace, right? This formal economy, right? Or simply what takes place within the household, the private sector of the household, because there's a third realm, and it's the realm of the community in terms of the performance of unpaid work. And so it could be Black women who are coming together to during the Great Depression, for example. There's the case, one of my favorite cases is the AKA sorority, Black women who understand that Black people who live in the Deep South are not having their health needs met. And so members of this sorority get together, and over a 3-year period, they organize a group of volunteers who go into the Mississippi Delta, and they provide screening services and medical services for Black sharecroppers, many people who had never had medical services before. That took an enormous amount of work at all stages, gaining the confidence of people, coordinating the efforts, administering the services, 3 years every summer, right? So that's one example, but that's one example out of many. And if we look at the case of other groups within the United States who are racialized, Mexican Americans, indigenous people, they also have a long history, ongoing history of performing work collectively on behalf of their communities as well. So that has really been the way that I have understood unpaid work, is that it is performed collectively on behalf of a community. And so it allows us to think then more broadly about the intersections between different forms of oppression, and to connect it with exploitation as well.
I really loved how you mentioned people's lived experience as something you were interested in your research. And I say that because myself, I'm a qualitative researcher as well. And while I appreciate, quantitative methods, in policy and in economics, a lot of times that approach is devalued or not considered rigorous enough. But it seems to me like a lot of the insights that you've found to broaden perspectives about what is work, what are people doing, how is the economy actually functioning, involved asking questions to find out how people actually lived through narratives. I have a quick clip here to show as well about the way that quantitative methods are sometimes used to put forward bad faith arguments.
Let's get precise about this. Okay.
Let's get precise.
To what degree is my present level of attainment or achievement a consequence of my white privilege? And I don't mean sort of. I mean, do you mean 5%? Do you mean 15%? Do you mean 25%? Do you mean 75%? And what do you propose I do about it? How about a tax? How about a tax that's like specialized for me so that I can account for my damn privilege, so that I can stop hearing about it? Now, let's get precise about one other thing, okay? We'll get precise.
So, I mean, ridiculous, right? Truly ridiculous.
Truly ridiculous.
Doesn't help that he sounds like Kermit the Frog.
Doesn't help.
Or looks like him.
Or looks like him. But there's this kind of impulse to push aside or repress these deeper questions about political categories, about concepts, and how they relate with the quantitative analysis or data, and just immediately go to that. How can we help people who may not be academics or be in graduate school think a little differently about the value of stories, of these social concepts that are just as important as, how much are you going to tax me to to deal with my privilege, which is completely absurd.
Yeah, it's a great question. For me, you've mentioned narratives quite a bit. And so, when narratives means stories always makes things more accessible, I think. And stories have a way of drawing connections between events, places, ideas. Stories can, provoke us to think about our own memories as well. So I like narratives. I think that the word narratives also makes me think about the importance of oral traditions as well, and communities that have long oral traditions of passing on history, and that history is every bit as valid as histories that were written down, often recorded by other people, people who were outsiders. So narratives, storytelling, really important way of recalling information, historical information. And I also think about the importance of narratives in terms of archival research. For me, it's also about unearthing voices that too often have been excluded and that we don't hear. But narratives, I think that narratives, that telling stories is also very effective because it gets at our emotions, right? In a way that data often doesn't do. So I think that that's really the benefit of using narratives to try to convey information, because it often can hit us very personally on an emotional level in a way that statistics can't do.
Right. We often hear that, quote, facts don't care about your feelings, as if the emotional realm had nothing to offer the lives we live and the political situations uh, that we're experiencing. And the clip, of course, was Jordan Kermit Peterson, kind of a conservative ideologue there. Um, when we think about addressing these racial inequalities, these systemic injustices, um, how do you think we can better talk about these problems outside of kind of this narrow focus on, thinking about inequality in terms of, yes, income, and also kind of the qualitative dimension of things?
Yeah. I mean, this is the important question because this over the last 2 weeks, my intermediate political economy class focused on race. It's a huge topic that I tried to talk about in 2 weeks, and it was really tough, right? Because part of the challenge is that we are bombarded with false narratives. We're bombarded with language that distorts the truth as well. So yeah, I don't know because the problem is so big. The topics are um, interconnected, right? And so I started out talking about class, and then I talked about gender, right? And then I went into a section on race. And so for me, the key way of trying to frame the problem was to frame it in terms of enabling myths of race, right? And so earlier, my students learned about, when they were learning about Marx, they learned about structural issues and ideological issues and the way in which ideas and institutions interact with things at a structural level, right? There's a back and forth relationship between them. And so in the section on race, I really tried to get my students to think critically about things that we often believe on the level of common sense. The United States is a melting pot. Um, this is a land of immigrants where people have been they came into the country poor and they, pulled themselves up by their bootstraps. They were able to make it. We talk about the model minority. We talked about affirmative action, meaning, that it's a quota system, that it's reverse discrimination, and that Black people are unqualified, right? So for me, there was a narrative there. It was trying to think about these ideas that represent a false narrative, that distort the reality. This is William Duggar talks about enabling myths of class, right? So these are the enabling myths of race, that it's a distortion of reality. It tries to justify the status quo. And so for me, I think it's successful if I'm able to get students to really think differently and more critically on some of the things that they take for granted and assume are true.
That was so beautifully put, and one of the reasons why I feel so passionate about intersectionality, which is also so commonly attacked with myths that completely distort reality, is the way that it encourages people to stretch ourselves and really make connections about the interdependencies and overlapping ways that different categories like class and race and gender are shaping one another, and that things like stories are also being shaped and also shape the hard data as well. So, that was such a great way to explain that. Let's talk about the job guarantee for a bit now. So, there's been several kind of ways to articulate what a job guarantee might look like. We have a resolution in our Congress. How does a job guarantee speak to the research you've done, and the kind of knowledge you've developed, the research you've done on work, both in the household, outside the household, paid, unpaid? What does a job guarantee do that is so important?
So, I think a federal job guarantee is essential in a country like the United States where, racism, anti-Blackness is fundamental to the way in which our economy operates. African Americans are not going to have um, job opportunities to the same degree as non-Black people because of racial discrimination. And so, when I think about the benefit, one of the primary benefits of the federal job guarantee is that it means that people who face discrimination based on race, based on ethnicity, based on gender, based on a number of categories, um, finally can have an opportunity to have employment, have mobility within the job, but also federal job guarantee, the way that I understand it. And I think about it in terms of the work of um, um, uh, Sandy Darity and Derek Hamilton and Mark Paul. So I think about it in terms of good jobs, right? That the federal government provides jobs when the economy is in a downturn, and that those jobs have ladders, the jobs have minimum wages that are livable wages, the jobs have benefits, and that the jobs address needs at local levels, right, at various levels, right. So it's not it's not a what is it called, a workfare type of program. These are jobs that provide dignity as well. So there's the benefit of people having access to jobs, and mobility, and livable wages and benefits. People who often don't have that. That, of course, enables people to be able to reach their potential. But I think about it, not just in terms of the benefit to Black workers, but I think about it in terms of benefits to people who are, um, who face economic precarity because of their skills. And so it's a way for people to be brought into the economy and to have job training as well, right? So there are broad-based benefits to people who experience discrimination in labor markets. There are benefits to people who are underemployed, as you said, right? So it addresses all kinds of problems that have been persistent in our economy. And then the other thing is for me, it is a win-win, right? So it's like it's a program to me that is a no-brainer. That people on the left would support it because of the idea of that everybody should have a right to a job. So it taps into our notions of economic justice and the ability of people to have meaningful work and reach their potential. But for people on the right, I think the idea of having access to work goes to the ideas that they have about individual responsibility, personal responsibility, and people working, and also paying taxes. And there's the potential to collect tax revenue, and also from their spending to stimulate the economy. So for me, it's a no-brainer. And the failure, I think, is one of messaging, that we have not promoted this as effectively as we need to. so that we can have a coalition of people supporting it.
In progressive circles, you hear a lot about, to get this done, we really need to tax wealthy people. And it becomes a big political conversation of, oh, we have to tax wealthy people in order to pay for the needs of poor people. Of course, we know that it's even true today that we have working class people working, 10 times as hard as CEOs of companies. We have CEO pay 398 times the average worker at a company. It's insane. Also, we have this path dependency of wealth that's accumulated in the hands of a lot of, white families in the South, is in their hands because of chattel slavery in the United States. And a lot of people talk about how politically complicated it would be to reckon with all of that. But a lot of progressives, I think, and just economists in general, don't really acknowledge that it's a myth that we have to rely on tax revenue in order to get big public programs done, like a federal jobs guarantee. Can you talk a little bit about that taxpayer myth and your analysis?
Mhm. Yeah, no, I can't, to be honest. I know that's the MMT, right, approach, not my area. I have nothing to say on it. The only thing I have to say on it is that some of the smartest people I know are proponents of MMT. And so I'm convinced because of who's been saying that, I'm convinced that what they are saying makes sense. But can I explain it? No, beyond my realm of expertise.
From one bank to another, I'm satisfied with that answer. That's great. Um, so I wanted to ask, I remember being in graduate school and I got this terrible job. I don't want to say that. I got a job with behavioral economists, and they had this program where they're like, we're going to help low income, high performing students in high school get into college. And we're going to take everyone who qualified for free and reduced lunch but scored well on the PSAT 10, and we're going to give them Walmart gift cards for like $10 every time they complete a step of college readiness prep. And I was like, well, first of all, you're excluding a lot of the kids that never got a chance to score well in the PSAT 10. Second of all, I'm in this research lab. I'm like, I qualified for free and reduced lunch. This program would not have helped me go to college because we have this huge barrier of tuition, how to fill out FAFSA, having family members that understand the college application process. My parents didn't go to college. And so I was like, they don't even know what questions to ask. So I love that your research revolves around lived experiences. They guide a lot of your analysis, but also our lived experiences guide the research questions we ask at all. A lot of folks talk about economics like it's a science, but we exist in the economy and society, of course. I'm curious, we know Sadie Alexander being the first Black economist. I don't think it's a coincidence that she's also the first economist to write about a jobs guarantee. I'd love to know how your lived experience shapes the research questions that you ask and what research you plan on working on in the future.
Hmm, the future. Okay, so how does it shape my how did it shape my lived experience shape my research on Sadie Alexander? My lived experience shaped my dissertation research because I studied development economics and comparative systems. And when it came time to write the dissertation, I realized that what I really wanted to research was African American women and African American women who had been working as domestic servants because there was so little of that research being performed within economics. So my lived experience of hearing my great aunt, for example, talk about how horrible it was to work as a domestic servant, or living in a town that was racially segregated, where Black people all lived, nearly all Black people lived in one side of the city, and white people lived everywhere else. Black people in my town, for the most part, were working class, were low income. Many lived in housing projects. And so that lived experience certainly made me think that these kinds of questions about work and racial justice and equity were important issues to explore and to fight for in economics. And then, so that was the only way I could do that, was to do archival research, because there was no data on Black women who were migrating from the South to the North. There wasn't any data on their self-expressions, their perceptions. That was all qualitative. So I did this archival research, and it's that lived experience, the fact that I um, had the skills, the knowledge to be able to do extensive archival research, and the fact that I had training as a feminist economist, so I had a particular lens that I brought to bear on my research on Sadie Alexander, which would be beneficial in thinking about her life, um, um, aspects of her engagement with the community, her family life. And then the other part of it is, because my program was not well funded, my doctoral program was not very well funded, and because I was doing archival research in Pennsylvania, I ended up working as a graduate student to be able to do this research. I took a job in Maryland. It took a long time to do. So where was I going with that? So I take a job, and I'm teaching courses on African American history, right? So my lived experience as someone who had archival knowledge, um, who had extensive knowledge in African American history, and knowledge of feminist economics. All of that meant that I can't think of anybody who was more equipped to be able to do this archival research as an economist on Sadie Alexander. I brought a different lens to it than the historians or the legal scholars, and certainly any other economist, if they had bothered to ever do that kind of research, which of course they wouldn't have done that, because 20 years ago I started this, right, and I still haven't made it through all of the boxes of the archives. And then the lived experience of, let's see, in terms of the unpaid community work, that's probably the area where my lived experience had the most impact, because I ended up deciding that I really didn't want to be married. And so I separated from my husband when my children were small. And so the experience of being a lone parent, very difficult, but it gave me important insights about work, right? Unpaid work. And then observing the other African American women, not only around me but nationally, like collecting data on African American women, and knowing, or just from reading, that marriage rates were declining. They have been declining for the African American community since the late 1970s. All of that helped me to think about unpaid work differently, as did my own involvement in community-based projects with other African American women. And then, of course, going back to, the knowledge of African American women throughout U.S. history, that also influenced my ability to generate this, new way of thinking about unpaid work. Much of it was tied to lived experience, my experience, as well as the experiences of other African American women.
I want to ask you, what work is next for you, and what work do you have out that you want to plug for our viewers and listeners? Because I'm sure
where can people find you?
Yeah.
The what work is next is that I have been working on this biography of Sadie Alexander for the last few years. So the book deal that I have with my publisher, Yale University Press, 2 books, a biography, and an edited volume. The biography was supposed to come out first. It was delayed because of COVID. And so I have been working on a biography of Sadie Alexander very diligently. And it focuses on her life into, not up until she died, but certainly into the civil rights movement. So that is the big project that I've been working on, biography of Sadie Alexander's life. I have a project that I am co-authoring with economist Rhonda Sharp. It is called Black Women in the U.S. Economy, the Hardest Working Woman. And, the hardest work women and then woman. It's a nod to Sojourner Truth's Aren't I a Woman? And so we are editing a volume that brings together the essays by social scientists, primarily Black women, but not exclusively Black women, who are writing about various aspects of Black women in the economy, education, health. I'm including my work on unpaid work or Black women in the social economy, for example. So that is ongoing. We're almost there in terms of having that one wrapped up, and that is pretty much it over the next couple of years. And then beyond that, I think I'm going to try to shift away from Sadie Alexander and maybe start to work on some of these other projects tied to women's unpaid collective work.
This has been such a great conversation. Thank you so much for coming on with us. Where should we tell our listeners to follow you? Do you have socials? Where should they look for your new work to come out?
Thank you. The new work will be out, I would say, probably within 2 years. My publisher thinks it's going to be in a year, but I'm more confident in 2 years. And that'll also be with Yale University Press, a biography of Sadie Alexander. I am on Twitter. I mainly retweet, but or repost. But I am on Twitter. That's pretty much the only place I am in terms of social media these days.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much for coming on, Professor Banks.
Thank you for having me on. It's been a real pleasure.